Well, it's wonderful to see all of you here. It's great to be together in this space. Danny laid out the plan for the next few hours. I want to begin by giving you a little history and by stretching you to think about some of these issues around climate and agriculture in a slightly different way, a bigger way, a systems way. But let's start with a little history. So there were two events that occurred in fall of 2018 that really propelled forward this idea of agriculture as a climate solution. In October of that year, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, issued a report, as they do every year, but the report in 2018 made it very clear that as critically important as it was to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that were occurring, that would not be enough. That we also had to pursue so-called natural solutions. And one of those, at the top of their list, was the potential power of regenerative agricultural practices. Practices that, yeah, good stuff, real hope, we'll get to that. Practices that would build soil health and in so doing naturally sequester atmospheric carbon. Now, there are many benefits of building soil health, including carbon capture, and it's not a new idea. In some ways, it goes back to indigenous practices and things that were being done a millennium ago. But in more recent times, it's really been something of the last 40 years or so, where a few forward-looking government officials, policymakers at times, academics, and some non-governmental organizations like American Farmland Trust that I had had the opportunity of running since 2016. We've been in this space. American Farmland Trust, AFT, I'll use the abbreviated version in the interest of time here. AFT in some ways led this charge. In 1981, Norm Berg, who was then the chief of USDA's Soil Conservation Service, he lost his job when President Reagan came into office. And he came to work for AFT for the next 26 years. AFT had been formed the previous year, in just 1980, under somewhat unique circumstances. The 70s were a period of real tension between the environmental and the agricultural communities. And AFT was specifically formed to try to bring those two worlds together. As such, we created and then led a conservation coalition comprised of a small handful of those agricultural organizations and environmental organizations that were willing to sit down at the table and work together. Under Norm Berg's leadership, AFT developed a white paper on soil health. That became the intellectual fuel behind this coalition's advocacy efforts that led to the incorporation in the 1985 Farm Bill of the conservation title. Now, again, good thing to applaud, good stuff, because it is the conservation title that has, since 1985, really been the primary instrument through which regenerative practices has been discussed and advanced. That's one event, the ICP report. The second event occurred in November of 2018, when the Democrats took control of the House of Representatives. And what that meant was that Speaker Pelosi created a special select committee on the climate crisis. Now, AFT helped plant a seed at that time with some key members in Congress that when this committee met, agriculture should be on their agenda, and talking about agriculture in a different way, as a hopeful potential solution to the climate crisis. AFT was one of the entities that testified, and one of our research scientists shared data that had been compiled and research done with USDA's Agricultural Resource Service that basically showed that agriculture done right could actually not only bring American farming to a place of carbon neutrality, but ultimately go beyond that, be a carbon sink to help offset emissions from other sectors. This is huge. Such hope, right? This is huge. So for the first time, some policymakers and members of the public were realizing the incredible power of agriculture, not just to grow our food, but to provide critical ecological services that were desperately needed to heal our planet. Now, this new awareness of agriculture as a potential climate solution has played out now in multiple ways, but I'm going to focus on just one because it's really a sea change. Congress in 2022 passed the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which included $20 billion for the agricultural programs that were in the conservation program. This is significant in two ways. The first is the amount of money. The conservation title since 1985 had basically provided about $100 to $110 billion worth of cost share programs for farmers, about $3 billion a year. The IRA in one fell swoop was adding $20 billion on top of that amount. Huge, huge. But the second point I think is more significant, and that is for the first time ever, Congress, through its actions, was recognizing that the programs in the Farm Bill's conservation title, the tried and true practices, were part of the answer to combating climate change. This is a complete mindset change. Congress had never made that statement in that way before. It is truly significant. They were saying we have the tools, we just need to bring it up to greater scale. Good stuff all around. And yet, I don't want to give anyone the idea that these funds are the full answer. Far from it. It's a down payment on what we need. But actually, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the other thing I don't want you to get in your brain and get focused on. Most of these programs are about pushing for regenerative practices, which are incredibly important. But the primary point I want to leave you with today is that it takes more than regenerative practices to make this work. They are not the full answer either. They're only going to produce the results we need with climate if we have sufficient farmland and if we have the right farmers and ranchers who are following those practices and can afford to stay in business as they do so. So, there's a lot at stake here. The way American Farmland Trust sees it is it's about the practices, obviously, but it is also about the land itself, and it's about the people who steward that land. We view it as a system. It's a three-legged stool. Now, some of you may be saying, of course, that's obvious. But there's some nuance in what I'm about to talk about. So listen carefully. Let's start by talking about farmland and talking about the interplay between farmland and better farming practices. Now, American Farmland Trust for decades has been tracking farmland loss, and at present we lose about 2,000 acres a day. 2,000 acres a day, 750,000 acres, 750,000 acres every year. Now, the good news is 45 years ago, that rate was actually a lot higher. The steps that have been taken with farmland protection and smart growth have made a difference. But that is still way too much farmland to lose. Way, way too much. But the loss of farmland means more than you may think. Obviously, with every acre you lose the potential of that acre of land to be used for regenerative practices that would bring back a whole host of environmental benefits, water recharge, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, and of course, carbon sequestration. So you lose an acre of land, you lose that potential. But it goes beyond that. With every acre that you lose, you also put more pressure on the remaining land to be farmed in a way that in many instances will mean fewer environmental benefits. You know, how great it is that farming can simultaneously provide our food and ecosystem services. It's wonderful. And indeed, some form of regenerative practices on some farms can actually elevate the level of food production. But let's be real about this. The truth is that if we have to increase food production or even maintain current production on fewer acres, the need to maximize food production is going to mean more industrial agriculture and heavier reliance on chemical fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and the like. Losing farmland not only reduces the potential of that land to be used to be farmed well, but it almost ensures that other farmland will be farmed more poorly. It's a negative feedback loop, right? It's this downward spiral. Beyond this, AFT's research has documented the fact that there are direct climate benefits from farmland protection in avoiding the emissions that would come from development of that land. And beyond that, keep in mind that a lot of the negatives from agriculture stem from the fact that we, in other parts of the world, are deforesting land or taking native prairie and turning it into industrial agriculture, in part because we are losing existing farmland. So what's the bottom line on all of this? It's that saving land that is currently farmed is a critical environmental and climate solution. And yet farmland loss barely gets mentioned when we talk about agriculture and climate. In truth, now, we don't really know how much farmland we need to both feed the planet and provide critical ecological services. The studies that have been done to date really focus only on food production, with no regard to the need for farmland to provide these broader services. And perhaps that's understandable, because this is a big, complex issue. AFT has been doing research in this space for the US for 40 years at the intersection of land use and practices. And we're barely beginning to get our heads around this. Ultimately, this is going to take a major international effort to get us where we need to go. Who knows where that research would lead? But I think I can say one thing with assurance, and it's this: the amount of farmland that we need to both feed us and heal our planet is more than the amount of farmland we will need to just feed us if we don't intend to use agriculture as a climate solution. And that would be a travesty. So at this juncture, until we know more, let's do everything we can to save every acre of farmland that we may need. Now, let's switch. Let's talk about the third leg of the stool, right? Let's talk about farmers. As great as it is that regenerative agriculture done on enough acres of land can be a climate solution, if we don't have farmers who are committed to these practices, trained in these practices, and able to be successful in their business following these practices, it all goes for naught. Now, farming is complex. Regenerative agriculture can be super complex. It can require extra training. It can require special equipment. It's also just a tough thing for farmers to change their operations. But the good news is, even though we have an aging farmer population, we have many people who want to get into farming. That includes young people, and that includes people in mid-career, midlife, who want to start another career. But the barriers are high. And one of the greatest barriers is the cost of entry because of the high price of farmland. Now, this is one of many places where the three legs of the stool come together. One highly successful strategy to lower the cost of farmland is to permanently protect it with an agricultural conservation easement, which will not only make sure that that land is forever available for farming, but will make sure that if in the future it sells, it will sell as its value for farming, not its development value. In many parts of the US, this is a highly effective tool to make land more affordable for incoming farmers. Beyond this, we clearly know that incoming farmers are frequently much more open to the idea of new practices, regenerative practices in particular. But beyond all of that, AFT studies have shown that on protected land, whether you're a new farmer or an established farmer, you are far more likely to be thinking about soil health for obvious reasons. If you can't sell your land for development, your soil is your asset. So, land, practices, people. It all comes together here with one building upon the other. This is the value of a system, right? There's the negative feedback loop that I talked about before with farmland loss, but the example I just gave you is a positive feedback loop. We need to avoid those negative ones and build upon those positive ones. That's the key. Let me end by saying this. I suspect that everyone in this room is deeply committed to combating climate change and see the hope and potential of agriculture as one part of the answer. Some of you may be primarily excited about regenerative practices, and for good reason. You know, at AFT, I bet 75% of our staff who are working with farmers are doing so primarily to advance regenerative practices. It's important stuff. Focus is important. Yeah, applaud. We're here to applaud. These are all good things that are happening. Great things are happening, beginning to happen at scale. We need to take it to a higher scale. But the message I want to convey, and this is not meant to be a downer message, this is meant for you to think more broadly about how all these things are interconnected, is that we can deepen our understanding that beyond practices, we need to pay more and more attention to the land itself, and far, far more attention to the farmers and ranchers who steward that land. They are the ultimate key to success here. We sometimes, in parts of this country, I'm from Maine, you know, in Maine and the Northeast, we've elevated farmers in many cases to be heroes, at times climate heroes. That's wonderful. But that's not the case uniformly around this country. And we are increasingly seeing situations of people villainizing farmers because they're too big or they're this. We need all farmers, but we need all of them to elevate their game and do what's better by the earth. So think about practices, think about the land, and think about the people. Thank you very much.
We have time for one question from the audience. And by a question, I mean a question with a question mark at the end. All right? So I see somebody back here. There is a roving mic. You have 1 minute.
Thanks so much. You mentioned indigenous principles, farm basis for regenerative ag practices. My question is simple, hopefully. Is AFT collaborating with Native American lands, jurisdictions to encourage new farmers focusing on community-based farming there so that we can undo the food deserts across all our Native American lands and essentially preserve indigenous knowledge and ancient practices?
Yeah, great question. Woo! Critical area. You know, next year, AFT will work directly with probably 25,000 producers. That's our term for farmers and ranchers. I would say about a quarter of that will be historically underserved populations, including indigenous populations. We're doing a lot of work with black farmers as well. The future of agriculture will depend on everyone's engagement, and we are totally focused and committed to that kind of work. Thank you.
Stay right there. Oh. I lied. We have time for one more question. Right here. We're going to bring you a mic. Hold on 1 second. And Jared's going to hold on to that mic.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I got it.
Oh, thank you. I just want to question about the farmland laws that you were saying. Laws to what? To retail? Or because there's also information about we're losing farmland when it comes to small family farms to bigger farms. So we still have the same land to farm, but a different kind of share of farmers.
Yep.
So I was wondering, what do you mean?
Good questions. I urge all of you to go to our website, look up Farms Under Threat. There is more detail and data in there than you could ever want on farming. Farmland loss due to development pressures, farmland loss due to climate change, farmland loss due to solar development, which we're going to hear about later. But your question about, is that really loss? Yes. That 2,000 acres a day is land that goes out of agriculture. Out of agriculture. There is the phenomenon you're talking about, where there are small farms that are being gobbled up. Consolidation is occurring. That's land that's still in farming. One could argue whether there's enough eyes to acres ratio to have that all farmed really well. That's another next time with Food Tank. We can talk about that. But that is happening. But even when you take that into account, the actual number of acres being lost to agriculture is roughly 2,000 acres a day. Thank you.